6 small bodies lay motionless under the blazing Arizona sun, buzzards already circling overhead like death zone messengers. The oldest girl, maybe 14, clutched a rusted canteen that hadn't held water in 2 days. Her cracked lips moved in silent prayer while the youngest, a boy no older than 4, had stopped crying hours ago, a silence more terrifying than any scream. Minerva Blackwood spotted the wreckage from half a mile away. The overturned wagon sat like a broken bone against the endless desert, its canvas top shredded by wind and time. She'd been tracking wild horses when the glint of metal caught her eye, but now her weathered hands gripped the reins tighter. In 15 years of living alone on the edge of nowhere, she'd learned that other people's problems had a way of becoming your own grave. But something about the scene pulled at her chest. Maybe it was how still everything looked. Or maybe it was the way the buzzards kept landing and taking off, as if even they weren't sure their meal was ready. She thought about turning her horse around, riding back to her ranch where the only voices she heard were her own, and the wind through broken shutters. After losing her husband Samuel and their boy Jacob to an Apache raid 5 years back, she'd sworn off caring about anything with a heartbeat. Yet here she was, urging her horse forward through the scorching heat. The closer she got, the clearer the picture became. These weren't just any travelers. This was a family wagon, the kind that carried everything someone owned in the world, clothes scattered like tumbleweeds, a child's wooden toy half buried in sand, and worst of all, the shapes that hadn't moved since she first spotted them. The oldest girl's eyes snapped open as Minerva's shadow fell across her face. Those eyes held a mixture of hope and terror that made Minerva's stomach twist. The girl tried to speak but only managed a hoarse whisper that sounded like, "Please." Behind her, 5 other children lay in various states of consciousness, their small bodies already showing the brutal signs of desert exposure. Minerva climbed down from her horse, her boots hitting the sand with a soft thud. She'd seen death before, plenty of it, but something about these children made her chest feel like it was being crushed in a vice. The girl who'd opened her eyes was clearly the oldest, with sun-bleached hair and a face that had aged years in what couldn't have been more than days. She wore a torn blue dress that might have been pretty once, and her arm was wrapped protectively around a smaller child who couldn't have been more than 6. Water. That's what they needed first, but Minerva only had enough in her canteen for maybe 2 of them. In this heat, sharing it might save them all or kill them all. Her hand hovered over the canteen at her hip while her mind raced through possibilities. Her ranch was 8 miles east, but these children couldn't make that journey in their condition. Leaving them here to fetch help meant risking that she'd return to find corpses. But as she looked at their faces, some peaceful in unconsciousness, others twisted with pain, she realized the choice had already been made, not by her mind, but by something deeper that she'd thought died with her own family. She uncapped her canteen and knelt beside the oldest girl, tilting the container toward those parched lips. The girl drank desperately, water running down her chin as her body remembered what it felt like to be alive. When she'd had enough, she grabbed Minerva's wrist with surprising strength and pointed to the smaller children. No words needed, Minerva understood. Save them first. But as Minerva moved to the next child, she heard something that made her blood freeze. Hoofbeats in the distance, coming fast from the north. In this part of the territory, riders moving with that kind of urgency usually meant one of 2 things: outlaws running from the law, or something worse, hunting for easy prey. The riders emerged from the heat shimmer like demons from hell itself. 3 men on horseback, their faces hidden behind bandanas and their guns already drawn. Minerva's hand instinctively moved to the rifle on her horse, but she was caught in the worst possible position, kneeling beside the children, completely exposed with nowhere to run. The lead rider pulled up 30 feet away, close enough for Minerva to see the cruel intelligence in his eyes above the dirty cloth covering his mouth. His horse snorted and stamped, sensing the tension that crackled between them like lightning before a storm. The other 2 spread out to flank her, a move that spoke of experience in situations like this. Minerva slowly stood, keeping her hands visible but ready. She'd survived this long in hostile territory by reading men like weather patterns, and everything about these 3 screamed danger. The way they sat their horses, the casual confidence of their gun hands, the fact that they'd approached a lone woman in the desert without hesitation. None of it pointed to anything good. The leader spoke first, his voice rough as sandpaper. Well, what do we have here? A regular angel of mercy, it looks like." His eyes moved from Minerva to the children scattered around the wagon wreckage, and his tone shifted to something that made her skin crawl. "Mighty convenient, finding all these little ones out here with nobody to look after them. The oldest girl, the one who'd grabbed Minerva's wrist, struggled to sit up despite her weakness. Her eyes darted between the armed men and Minerva, intelligence burning bright despite her condition. She understood the danger, even in her state, and Minerva saw her inch closer to the smaller children, as if her 14-year-old body could somehow shield them from what was coming. Minerva kept her voice steady, though every instinct screamed at her to grab her rifle. "Just passing through and saw the wagon. These children need water and medical attention." She gestured toward her horse. "I've got supplies that might help." The second rider, a thin man with nervous eyes, laughed at something that wasn't funny. "Supplies," she says. "Jack, you think she's got the kind of supplies we're looking for?" His gaze lingered on the children in a way that made Minerva's blood boil, but she forced herself to stay calm. Anger would get them all killed. Jack, apparently the leader, urged his horse closer. "Funny thing about this territory, lady. Dangerous for folks traveling alone, especially with valuable cargo." His meaning was clear as desert air, and Minerva felt her jaw clench despite her efforts to appear unthreatening. The third man, silent until now, finally spoke up. His voice carried a different quality, educated, which somehow made him more frightening than the others. "The question is, what's a woman like you doing out here alone? This isn't exactly a place for Sunday rides." His horse stepped sideways, positioning him to cut off any escape route to the east. Minerva realized with growing dread that these men weren't random desperados. They moved with too much coordination, asked too many specific questions. Either they'd been watching her ranch, or they knew exactly who she was and what her presence here meant. The thought that they might have been following her, waiting for exactly this kind of opportunity, made her stomach turn. The oldest girl made a small sound, half cough, half plea, and tried to speak. "Please," she managed, the word barely audible but carrying the weight of 6 lives hanging in the balance. Jack's attention shifted to her, and his eyes narrowed with the kind of focus that predators reserved for wounded prey. But as the standoff stretched tighter than a bowstring, Minerva heard something else cutting through the desert silence. Another set of hoofbeats, coming fast from a different direction. The question was whether salvation was riding toward them, or if their nightmare was about to get even worse. The approaching rider wore the star of a territorial marshal, but instead of relief, Minerva felt her blood turn to ice water. Marshal Cade Brennan had a reputation that stretched from Tucson to Santa Fe, not for justice, but for the kind of law enforcement that came with a price tag. His presence here, in the middle of nowhere, wasn't coincidence. Jack and his men immediately shifted their positions, but they didn't holster their weapons. The fact that they weren't running told Minerva everything she needed to know about who was really in charge here. Brennan pulled up his sweating horse and surveyed the scene with the cold calculation of a man counting money. "Gentlemen," Brennan said, tipping his hat in mock courtesy. His voice carried the smooth confidence of someone who'd never met a situation he couldn't profit from. "And the lovely Mrs. Blackwood. Fancy meeting you out here in such interesting circumstances." The way he said her name made Minerva's skin crawl. Brennan knew exactly who she was, which meant he'd been planning this encounter. Her isolated ranch, her reputation for avoiding town and people, her tragic past that kept her vulnerable and alone, it all made perfect sense now. These children weren't just victims of circumstance. They were bait. The oldest girl's breathing had become shallow and rapid. Minerva could see her struggling to stay conscious, to keep watch over her siblings even as her body began shutting down from dehydration and exposure. The sight of this 14-year-old fighting to protect children who couldn't protect themselves sent a familiar rage burning through Minerva's chest. The same fury she'd felt watching Apache warriors ride away from her burning home 5 years ago. Brennan dismounted with theatrical slowness, his spurs jingling in the desert silence. "You know, Mrs. Blackwood, there's been some concern about your well-being, living alone out there. No family, no protection. Some folks think it might be time for you to consider a change of scenery." The pieces clicked together in Minerva's mind like bullets sliding into a chamber. Her ranch sat on prime water rights, the kind that big cattle operations would kill for. With her dead, the land would go to territorial auction, probably for a fraction of its worth. And who better to arrange such a convenient accident than a corrupt marshal and his hired guns? "Especially," Brennan continued, walking closer to the children, "when there are innocent lives at stake. These poor orphans need proper care, don't you think? A woman alone in the wilderness can't possibly provide the kind of protection they require." One of the smaller children, a boy maybe 7 years old, started to whimper softly. The sound seemed to trigger something in the oldest girl, who somehow found the strength to pull him closer despite her own condition. Her fierce protectiveness reminded Minerva so strongly of her own maternal instincts that it felt like a physical blow. Jack's nervous partner spoke up, his voice eager with anticipation. "Marshall's right, lady. Desert's no place for children. Lucky for them, we know some folks who specialize in taking care of orphans. Real profitable kind of care, if you catch my meaning." The implication hit Minerva like a sledgehammer. These weren't just land grabbers, they were traffickers. The children weren't witnesses to be eliminated, they were merchandise to be sold. And Minerva had walked straight into their trap. But as Brennan reached down toward the oldest girl, his intentions crystal clear, something inside Minerva snapped with the finality of a breaking bone. Minerva's hand moved faster than desert lightning. Her Colt .45 cleared leather and spoke once, the gunshot echoing off distant canyon walls like thunder. Brennan's hat flew backward as the bullet parted his hair by less than an inch, close enough that he could feel the heat of its passage. The corrupt marshal froze, his hand still reaching toward the girl. Every man present understood the message. The next shot wouldn't be a warning. Minerva's reputation with a gun wasn't just frontier legend. She'd learned to shoot from Comanche raiders who'd taught her that hesitation meant death for everything you loved. "Touch one of these children," Minerva said, her voice carrying the quiet certainty of a loaded gun, "and I'll paint this desert with your brains." The barrel of her Colt never wavered, trained dead center on Brennan's forehead. Around them, the other 3 men shifted nervously, but none were foolish enough to draw on a woman who'd just demonstrated she could part a man's hair at 20 paces. Jack's educated companion spoke carefully, his cultured voice tight with controlled fear. "Mrs. Blackwood, you're making a serious mistake. Marshal Brennan represents territorial law. Threatening an officer is a hanging offense." Minerva's laugh held no humor whatsoever. "Law? The only law I see here is 4 men planning to murder a woman and sell children like cattle." Her finger tightened fractionally on the trigger, and Brennan's face went pale beneath his sun-weathered skin. "Question is, which one of you wants to die first, testing my resolve?" The oldest girl used the distraction to drag herself closer to the smaller children, positioning her body between them and the men. Despite her weakness, her eyes burned with fierce determination that reminded Minerva of her own mother, a woman who'd defended their homestead against raiders with nothing but a shotgun and pure stubborn will. But Minerva knew she couldn't maintain this standoff indefinitely. 4 against 1, even with surprise on her side, wasn't sustainable. Her horse stood 20 feet away with her rifle, but reaching it meant exposing her back to armed men who'd already proven they had no moral boundaries. The children needed immediate medical attention, but every second this confrontation continued was a second closer to someone making a fatal mistake. If you were Minerva, what would you do? Trust that her reputation would make these men back down and risk them calling her bluff, or start shooting and guarantee a gunfight with 6 dying children caught in the crossfire? Tell me in the comments. I need to know which side you'd choose, because what Minerva decided next would determine whether she'd become their savior or their executioner. Brennan slowly raised his hands, but his eyes held the calculating look of a man buying time rather than surrendering. "Easy now, Mrs. Blackwood. No need for bloodshed. Maybe we can work out some kind of arrangement beneficial to everyone involved." The thin rider with nervous eyes started edging his horse sideways, trying to get an angle on Minerva without her noticing. But she'd been watching for exactly that kind of movement, and her peripheral vision caught his subtle repositioning. In the desert, survival meant noticing every shadow, every shift in the landscape, every detail that didn't belong. "The arrangement is simple," Minerva replied, tracking the nervous rider's movement without taking her primary aim off Brennan. "You 4 ride out of here and never come back. I take these children to safety, and we all pretend this conversation never happened." The youngest child, the 4-year-old boy who'd stopped crying hours ago, suddenly made a small sound and went completely limp. His tiny body wasn't moving anymore, and the oldest girl's face crumpled as she realized what was happening. Time was running out faster than water through sand, and every second spent in this standoff was a second these children didn't have. But as Minerva felt the weight of impossible choices crushing down on her shoulders, she heard a sound that changed everything, the distinctive whistle of an Apache war cry coming from the rocks above them. The Apache war cry cut through the desert air like a blade, instantly transforming enemies into reluctant allies. 5 warriors emerged from behind rock formations where they'd been watching the confrontation unfold, their faces painted for war and their weapons ready for blood. In the brutal mathematics of frontier survival, Apache raiders trumped corrupt lawmen and land grabbers every time. Brennan's face went from pale to ashen gray. "Sweet Jesus," he whispered, his hand moving instinctively toward his gun before remembering that Minerva's Colt was still trained on his skull. The nervous rider's horse started dancing sideways, sensing its rider's terror, while Jack cursed under his breath and looked frantically for escape routes that didn't exist. Minerva's mind raced through possibilities, all of them bad. The Apache had probably been tracking Brennan's group, waiting for the right moment to strike. Her presence here with dying children just made the situation more complicated and more dangerous. Apache warriors didn't typically take prisoners, especially not when they outnumbered their enemies and held the high ground. The oldest girl somehow found enough strength to speak, her voice barely a whisper but carrying desperate urgency. "Please, the little ones." She was looking directly at Minerva, trusting her to make the right choice even as death approached from multiple directions. The weight of that trust felt heavier than mountains. The lead Apache warrior, a man with scars across his chest that spoke of many battles survived, raised his rifle and shouted something in his native language. Whatever he said made his companions spread out along the ridge, positioning themselves to create a killing field with no escape. These weren't young hotheads looking for glory. These were experienced fighters who understood exactly how to eliminate threats efficiently. Brennan tried to project authority even with his voice shaking. "I'm a territorial marshal. Attacking me is an act of war against the United States government." The Apache warrior's response was a laugh that held no warmth whatsoever, followed by words in English that were perfectly clear. "Your government means nothing in our land, Tin Star Man." The 4-year-old boy who'd gone limp suddenly gasped and started breathing again, but his tiny chest moved in irregular rhythms that suggested his body was fighting a losing battle. The oldest girl pressed her ear to his chest, tears streaming down her sunburned cheeks as she listened to his heart struggle to keep beating. Minerva realized with crystal clarity that traditional options were gone. Running meant abandoning the children to certain death. Fighting meant a 5-way gun battle with kids caught in the crossfire. Surrendering meant trusting Apache warriors who had every reason to hate white settlers, especially considering what had happened to her own family 5 years ago. But as she watched the oldest girl desperately trying to keep her little brother alive, something clicked in Minerva's memory. The lead Apache warrior's scars, the way he held his rifle, even his laugh. She'd seen him before, not in battle, but in a moment of unexpected mercy that had saved her life when her husband and son were killed. If you're loving this story so far, hit that subscribe button, because what happens next will blow your mind. The warrior's eyes met hers across the deadly distance, and she saw the exact moment when recognition dawned in his dark gaze. The Apache warrior's name was Nalnish, and 5 years ago he'd been the one to pull her from the burning wreckage of her home, while his war party finished destroying everything she'd loved. But instead of killing her, he'd whispered something in Apache that she'd never understood, touched the silver locket around her neck that held her son's picture, and simply walked away. Now he stood 40 feet above them on the rocky ridge, his weathered face showing the same strange mix of recognition and calculation that had saved her life once before. The other warriors looked to him for orders, their rifles trained on the group below, like vultures waiting for a signal to feast. Nalnish called out in accented English, his voice carrying across the desert with undeniable authority. "Woman with dead son's memory." He gestured toward the locket that still hung around Minerva's neck, catching sunlight like a signal mirror. "You should not be here with Tin Star men who steal children." Brennan tried to interject, his voice cracking with desperation. "These children are under territorial protection. I'm bringing them to proper authorities." But Nalnish's contemptuous snort suggested he understood exactly what kind of protection a corrupt marshal offered innocent kids. The oldest girl suddenly spoke up, her voice weak but determined. "My name is Emma. These are my brothers and sisters. Our parents died 3 days ago when our wagon broke down." She gestured toward the wreckage behind them. "This lady, she's the first person who tried to help us." Something in Emma's tone, the fierce protectiveness despite her own condition, seemed to resonate with Nalnish. Apache culture valued courage above almost everything else, and this 14-year-old girl was showing more bravery than the 4-armed men who'd been planning to exploit her family's tragedy. Jack's educated companion made a fatal mistake by slowly reaching for his gun, Apparently thinking the Apache attention was focused elsewhere, Nalnish's rifle swung toward him with fluid precision, and his voice dropped to a whisper that somehow carried more menace than any shout. "Move that hand one more inch, book reader, and vultures will feast on your eyes tonight." The man's hand froze halfway to his holster, sweat beading on his forehead despite the fact that the sun was beginning its descent toward the western horizon. Time was running out in more ways than one. These children needed medical attention that none of them could provide in the middle of hostile territory. Minerva made a decision that went against every survival instinct she'd developed over 15 years of frontier living. She slowly holstered her Colt and raised both hands, addressing Nalnish directly. "These children will die without help. I have medical supplies at my ranch, 8 miles east. Let me take them there." Nalnish studied her face for a long moment, his dark eyes seeming to look straight through her soul. When he finally spoke, his words carried the weight of ancient wisdom mixed with hard-earned pragmatism. "White woman who lost everything speaks truth. But 10 star men follow you, bring soldiers, bring more death to our land." The youngest child, the little boy who'd stopped breathing, suddenly convulsed and went completely still. Emma's scream of anguish cut through every other sound. Raw and primal and utterly heartbreaking, she pressed her face against his tiny chest, listening desperately for any sign of life. But Minerva could see from 20 feet away that they'd lost him. The silence that followed Emma's grief was broken by Nalnish's voice, now carrying a tone that suggested he'd reached some kind of internal decision. "One child is already walking the spirit trail. Others will follow unless—" He paused, looking directly at Brennan and his men. "Unless those who would harm children are prevented from following." Minerva understood the implicit offer, and it made her stomach turn even as she recognized its brutal logic. Minerva's voice cut through the desert air before Nalnish could give his warriors the signal to kill. "No." The single word carried absolute finality, stopping everyone mid-breath. "These men live, but they leave. Now. Forever." Brennan's face showed pure confusion. He'd expected either rescue or death, not mercy from the woman he'd planned to murder. Jack looked between his marshal and the Apache warriors, calculating odds that didn't favor survival either way. The nervous rider had gone completely pale, while the educated gunman kept his hands carefully visible and motionless. Nalnish tilted his head, genuinely puzzled by her decision. In Apache culture, enemies who threatened children deserved no mercy whatsoever. "White woman speaks strangely. These men would have sold young ones like horses. They planned your death for land and water. Why do they deserve breath in their lungs?" Emma looked up from her dead brother's body, her face streaked with tears and desert dust. "Because she's not like them," she whispered, somehow understanding Minerva's choice even through her grief. "She's not like them at all." Minerva kept her eyes on Nalnish, knowing that the next few seconds would determine whether justice or vengeance ruled this moment. "Killing them makes us no better than they are. Send them away broken and empty-handed. That's punishment enough for cowards who prey on children." Brennan tried to speak, probably to negotiate or threaten, but Nalnish silenced him with a gesture that suggested speaking would be the last mistake he ever made. The Apache leader studied Minerva's face for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Woman with dead son's memory chooses mercy over blood. This speaks well of her heart, but poorly of her wisdom." The second youngest child, a girl maybe 6 years old, started making soft whimpering sounds that indicated she was slipping away as surely as her little brother had. Time was bleeding away like water through cracked clay, and every second spent on moral debates was a second closer to losing another innocent life. Nalnish made his decision with the swift certainty of a man accustomed to leadership. He barked orders in Apache to his warriors, who reluctantly lowered their rifles but kept them ready. Then he switched back to English, addressing Brennan and his men with contempt that could have melted steel. "Tin Star Man and dog followers, you have choice. Ride north toward Mexico and never return to this territory, or stay here and feed ravens. Choose now, while woman with mercy still protects your worthless lives." Brennan's hands shook as he gathered his reins, his authority crumbling like sand in wind. Jack and the others needed no further encouragement. They spurred their horses northward so fast that dust clouds marked their retreat long after they disappeared beyond the horizon. But as the sound of hoofbeats faded into silence, Emma's voice rose in panic. "She's not breathing. Sarah's not breathing." The 6-year-old had gone completely limp in her sister's arms, and Minerva realized with horror that mercy had cost them precious seconds they couldn't afford to lose. Nalnish was already moving down from the ridge, his warriors following. but whether they came as allies or executioners remained terrifyingly unclear. Nalnish reached the 6-year-old girl before Minerva could move, his scarred hands surprisingly gentle as he pressed his ear to the child's chest. After a moment that felt like eternity, he looked up with grim determination. Heart still beats, but barely. She needs water, shade, and medicine we do not carry. Without hesitation, he lifted Sarah into his arms and called out something in Apache. 2 of his warriors immediately began constructing a makeshift stretcher from their spears and a blanket, moving with efficiency that spoke of battlefield experience. These men might be raiders, but they understood how to save lives as well as take them. Minerva knelt beside Emma, checking the remaining children while her mind raced through logistics. My ranch has everything we need: medical supplies, food, water, proper beds. But it's 8 miles through desert that'll kill them in their condition. Nalnish studied the horizon, then made a decision that surprised everyone present. Apache horses are strong. Warriors will carry children. You lead us to healing place. He looked directly into Minerva's eyes, and she saw something there that transcended the hatred between their peoples. Children's lives matter more than old wars. The next hour blurred together in controlled chaos. Nalnish's warriors worked with startling gentleness, lifting each child onto horses and positioning them for maximum comfort during the brutal ride ahead. Emma, despite her own weakness, insisted on staying conscious to watch over her siblings, her 14-year-old face showing a maturity that no child should ever need. Minerva led the strange procession across terrain that could kill the unwary, her horse picking its way between rocks and cactus while behind her, Apache warriors carried dying children with the care of protective fathers. The irony wasn't lost on her. 5 years ago, Apache raiders had destroyed her family. Today, Apache warriors were helping her save one. By the time they reached Minerva's ranch, the sun hung low on the western horizon, painting the sky in shades of red that matched the blood she'd been trying to prevent. Her modest house looked impossibly small to shelter so many people, but Nalnish's warriors immediately began the work of transformation, turning her front room into a makeshift medical station. Sarah was the worst, unconscious and burning with fever that spoke of serious dehydration. But as Minerva worked with herbs and clean water, Emma holding her sister's hand while Nalnish translated medical instructions to his warriors, something unexpected happened. The little girl's eyes fluttered open, focused on Emma's face, and whispered a single word: "Sister." It took 3 more hours, working by lamplight as the desert night settled around them, but gradually each child stabilized. Color returned to their faces. Breathing became regular, and most importantly, hope replaced the desperate fear that had marked their near-death experience in the wilderness. Emma was the last to allow herself rest, finally collapsing into sleep only when convinced that all her siblings would survive the night. As Minerva tucked a blanket around the exhausted teenager, she felt something she hadn't experienced in 5 years: the fierce, protective love of a mother watching over children. Nalnish approached quietly, his warriors already preparing to leave. "Woman with dead son's memory," he said softly. "You have new children now. Guard them well." He paused at the door, looking back one final time. Old debts are finished. New friendship begins here. As the Apache warriors disappeared into the night, Minerva stood watching over 6 sleeping children who'd become her responsibility, her family, her chance at redemption. Tomorrow would bring new challenges: legal questions about custody, the need to expand her home, the complex task of healing hearts as well as bodies. But tonight, in the gentle breathing of children who would live to see another sunrise, she heard something that had been missing from her life for far too long. She heard hope. If you enjoyed this incredible story of survival and redemption, make sure to subscribe to our channel for more amazing tales from the Old West. Now click on the video on the screen to hear a story even better than this one, with a twist so powerful you won't forget it anytime soon. Click on the video now.